Welcome to Fuse from PRCA, the podcast for marketers, communicators, and public relations professionals. My name's Dan Gold, and on today's episode, Farzana speaks to an incredibly interesting guest, Mehreen Khan, and here is their conversation.
I am incredibly thrilled to announce that we have Mehreen Khan with us as our special guest. Mehreen is the economics editor for The Times. Prior to The Times, she was the Brussels correspondent for the Financial Times for 5 years, and she was reporting on the European Union, Brexit, and the political economy of the eurozone. And prior to that, she was a sports journalist with the Telegraph, and she studied at Oxbridge, and she has done so well in terms of entering spaces such as the Times and the Telegraph and top tier media, and coming from a diverse background. So not only is Mehreen Khan, to our knowledge, the youngest ever to be the economics editor for the Times, she is the first woman to be the economics editor for the Times and the first ethnic minority to be the economics editor of the Times. So a huge congratulations, Mehreen, because you really are leading on multiple levels and pioneering diversity in the media. So welcome, Mehreen.
Thank you so much for having me, Farzana.
So, Mehreen, we'd love to know, you have been in spaces such as, Oxbridge and the Telegraph and the Financial Times and the Times. You've been in these spaces, being often the youngest in the room, the only ethnic minority, perhaps also, one of the only sort of women in the room as well, especially around sports journalism. I'd love to know how that has impacted your mindset and how that enriches your approach to journalism.
Sure. I mean, I think maybe we can start with what the job of a journalist is. And I know that you're asking the questions this time, and that's usually my position. But a lot of the things that a good journalist has to do is the ability to ask questions, the ability to listen, the ability to win over people's trust, to make people like you, to understand that, you're not trying to do them over necessarily. And then in financial journalism, some of the skill sets are a little bit different. You need to be able to be generally quite numerate, understand how numbers work, understand how kind of theoretical concepts like inflation, which is, it's difficult to get people to get their head around it and to make that kind of accessible. So in various different jobs, I've perhaps had to operate with various different skill sets. But I think now, maybe approaching 10 years of me being a working journalist, I think that I can look back and say different jobs have given me different skill sets. And I think ultimately I perhaps come away with a feeling that, you talked about entering spaces that, I would like to hope that I rarely am intimidated by powerful people, by sitting in front of politicians or media barons or CEOs or business owners. And ultimately, these people are so much of the subject of the stories that we write that, retaining some degree of detachment about the people that you write, feeling that you're not necessarily, you have to gain some degree of intimacy in terms of access, but you're not there to peddle anyone's stories. You're there to provide your readers with the most accurate sense of what you think is going on in that particular moment. And I think, maybe we can get into it a bit later, but I think notions like objectivity and neutrality in journalism are actually quite problematic, because we always have to recognize as journalists that when we choose to write about something, it often means that we've made another editorial decision to not give something else attention on that day. And that in itself is the act of making a choice. And when you do that, the pretense and idea of objectivity becomes much more problematic. So I think I've gained a lot of confidence. I've gained an amazing ability to listen to people, to break down ideas, to make them simple, to strive to have very accessible forms of journalism, to understand that actually what I'm there to do is serve readers, not necessarily to serve any other sort of special interest groups, and also to stimulate myself intellectually, to find new ideas and areas that tickle my interest, that challenge me as a reporter, whether it's long form interviews, news stories, online kinds of journalism, writing a column. So I think I've been incredibly lucky, and I feel very blessed that I've had the opportunity to do so many interesting things, and long may it continue. So I am the youngest editor of the Times, as far as I could tell, and hopefully I won't be the shortest serving either. So I hope I can stick around and do this for a while.
So Mehreen, I'm fascinated how you made the segue from sport to to finance. So you started off working with the Telegraph in sports journalism, and I just want to know a little bit about, obviously now we live in a very different sort of a very different sort of era where female sort of sport is more celebrated and covered. But back then, when you started, it wasn't exactly an environment conducive for for a woman working in sports journalism. So I wanted to know a little bit about why did you decide to start off your career in sports journalism, number one, and number two, how did you segue from sports journalism at the Telegraph to to becoming the Brussels correspondent at the FT?
Sure. When you say back in the day, it makes it sound like it actually was quite a long time ago. We're actually talking about probably 2014, 2015, when I joined the Telegraph as a trainee. And most trainees, they go through all parts of the newspaper, and often most people already know where they would like to be. They'd like to be a news reporter, they'd like to go to the lobby, or they'd like to cover culture or whatever. And for me, it was sport. That was how I got my entry into journalism when I was a student. I love football and cricket, and I started writing about it, and blogging in those days was very easy, and I'd upload my own sort of forms of writing. And I developed over time a reasonable amount of work, which then when I was applying for things like traineeships, I could point to the fact that I have some writing skills. And I was very, very fortunate that the Telegraph, which has a brilliant sports desk, after a couple of months of having me as their trainee, said that they'd love me to join them full time. And on the face of it, this is a dream, and I think it'd be a dream for many people who are aspiring sports journalists to crack into such a prestigious sports brand. And I actually said thanks, but no thanks. And as you sort of hinted at, it's because I think even in 2014, 2015, female representation in sports journalism on sort of in mainstream media organizations was not as advanced as it is today, where you can turn on your TV and the match of the day or Sky Sports, you have female presenters, female commentators, we have female referees and linesmen. We're talking at time of the Women's World Cup, which is getting huge amounts of coverage. So female participation and representation in sport at all levels has made massive strides. But even back then, we basically weren't where we are right now. And this is nothing to do with the Telegraph, but when I was out on my jobs, so reporting jobs, go and cover a match, go to Wimbledon, do the sort of interview racket that is sports journalists have to go through when, you're talking to people. I find it intensely intimidating environment. And I would have to put it down to the fact that a lot of people so other sports journalists, so that community of sports journalists, perhaps questioned why I was there, didn't think that I was worthy of being there. That's probably had something to do with my age. I was about 23 or 24. I was an ethnic minority. I was a non-traditional looking sports journalist just by virtue of being a woman. And I didn't enjoy it. And I thought it was, it took a toll on my mental health. I felt like I had to prove myself. And even though I thought, I really know my stuff, I began doubting my own abilities. So when the chance came along to take the permanent job, I said no, and I switched over to the business desk of the Telegraph. And now looking back in hindsight, I think financial journalism, even though I wasn't trained in it, is quite a meritocratic place. You don't necessarily have to look or sound a certain way to be a good financial journalist. As long as you grasp the principles of whatever beat you're covering, you can get on and do really well. And in some senses, it was a little bit, blind to my gender and to my colour, because I was able to make strides, I think, and have brilliant jobs in different parts of financial journalism. And at that point in time, I think sports journalism just wasn't really there yet. So I felt like I was carrying my gender and perhaps my ethnicity much more on my shoulder. And when I became a financial journalist, all of that sort of went out of the window. And the rest is history, as they say.
Speaking of which, you studied modern history and politics at Oxford, and then and what I wanted to sort of understand is your time during Oxford and the Telegraph, particularly during sort of sports journalism. Did you ever have a sense of imposter syndrome?
And the short answer is no. And I know that it's a phrase that people use a lot right now, and they associate it with women in sort of high or elite environments. I would say no, because I think I have, when I got to Oxford, I never knew anyone who's ever got into Oxbridge or into a state school. It was not even on my radar until a teacher thought that it might be a good idea. And I know that I had to work incredibly hard to get there. There was no sense in which I was afforded any natural inbuilt or socioeconomic advantages that would meant that my entry into these elite educational environments would be easier. If anything, I started basically from scratch. I basically had, it was a bit of a punt. So when I got there, I thought, actually, I'm definitely here on merit and through hard work. And that was definitely also true of the Telegraph, because I know that for them to hire someone like me in a sports journalism role it was at that point, it wasn't particularly normal. So they must have seen something in me to be able to do that. And then also when I moved into financial journalism, I think I definitely didn't feel imposter syndrome, but I felt intimidated by working in an environment where I've never studied finance, I've never studied economics. I come from a social sciences or history background, like a lot of people who are in journalism. They've usually studied arts degrees. But quickly, once you sort of get the fundamentals and you grasp it, you realize that financial journalism can be incredibly fun. At that time in the world, it was very political. It was a highly politically charged environment. So we're talking about, the first coalition government under George Osborne. So economic policy became a huge part of the political story. Austerity became a huge part of our political story. There was a debt crisis going on in the eurozone. The EU nearly fell apart because of some of the economic mistakes that it had made. We were still in the aftermath of a financial crisis, a banking crisis. So economics was very much, the stuff that when you turned on the BBC News at 10 o'clock, you're likely to be, the top of the hour is going to be dominated by a story related to economics and finance. So in that sense, it was a pretty sexy story. And I just really wanted to be involved in something that I felt like was the story of the day. So the zeitgeist was very much captured, I think, by financial journalism around the 2010s. And it's ebbed and flowed since, and I've done different jobs since. But, I really do thrive on the feeling that when, if I'm covering a beat, that it's an important beat in that particular moment. So perhaps that's the historian in me sort of wants to feel like I'm doing something that's going to matter.
Yeah. And speaking of which, you then went to go and live in Brussels for, was it about 5 years?
Yes.
And again, that was moving into a completely different space. So what was that like? Because again, you studied history, you like watching history unfold.
Yeah.
You like beats and where the topic that you're covering is a huge sort of driver of of what's happening in society. So tell me about your time in Brussels when you were the correspondent for the FT.
It was a brilliant experience. I only left Brussels last year, so 2022. So I was there just in the aftermath of Brexit, talk about historical events. So I arrived in 2017. Yeah, I arrived in
the wrong time. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe it's a bad indicator that if you turn up when everything's going wrong, then maybe maybe it's you. But no, Brussels was probably like the formative experience I've had as a reporter doing journalism. I was in, people call Brussels a bubble, and it is very much a bubble. I lived an expat life in a country where most people in my environment and ecosystem were there because they work for the European institutions, or they are covering the European institutions like myself, or they're in jobs that are adjacent to the European institutions, and lobbyists and lawyers. And it's all, people were there for a purpose, and they're often there for a small amount of time. And, that's where I really learned the thrill of breaking big stories and the sort of the adrenaline rush that comes with breaking important stories. But I also recognize that Brussels is a very special environment, and it was an odd environment to be in if you were a Brit after Brexit. And for myself, who's working for someone like the FT, which is an incredibly prestigious European news brand, I think I was in a slightly different mold than the classic FT Brussels correspondent. I was young, a female, also an ethnic minority. You have a funny sounding name. I encountered different challenges in Brussels in an environment where the press corps is incredibly white, incredibly non-diverse in every sense of the meaning of that word, including sort of skewing slightly older generationally, and where the subject is about policy, but actually, politics drives Brussels. And there were very sensitive things that happened while I was in Brussels, particularly Black Lives Matters, huge debates around racism in Europe, about policies around counterterrorism. And, I think my presence in Brussels sort of added for myself. There was a bit of tension between, I think, the kind of sometimes the cozy consensus that is driven by the European Union and the headquarters of the European Union, and someone like myself who came from a different background, who I think was pushing against a lot of these consensuses around what is good and what is bad about how we deal with certain things. And it was a different kind of challenge. It was, you had to be very tough. I think Brussels is the area of my journalism where I've attracted the most criticism online from people on social media, from the people that I write about. I really developed a very thick skin in Brussels. And it's sort of the stuff that I'm gonna.
How do you deal with it when you get sort of negative comments online or on Twitter? Do you just ignore, or do you engage and get into the pit? I mean, how do you deal with it? Some people have different sort of approaches. What?
I've changed, and I didn't realize this until I did that thing of going back and looking at my old tweets, and I was like, God, I really used to get involved. I would love a spat with someone online that I'd never met, who didn't know me from Adam, and I didn't know them from Adam, and I'd always reply. I was often, sardonic and, cutting towards people, and I've completely changed on that. I have a slightly, I think, novel approach to thinking about criticism, and often if my reporting is criticized or people are criticizing me, sort of taking, to use a football metaphor, the man and not the ball, I often take it as a sort of backhanded compliment, because ultimately, I didn't become a journalist because I want people to necessarily like me. I want to annoy people, and if those people are powerful, then that's all the better, right? If I've got under the skin of someone that I'm writing about because they didn't enjoy the framing, or that we got a piece of information that they didn't particularly want in the public domain, that's me doing my job properly. And a lot of the times in Brussels, the criticism was not really against what I was doing professionally, but it was more about me. And I had lots of feedback from people who were very upset that someone like me even worked for the FT. The FT, perhaps a bit like the Times, it commands quite a loyal, almost cultish readership. People are, they're so attached to the brand, and they often feel like they have a personal connection to its writers, even though they just see the byline. And I think at times being called Mehreen Khan, or having a social media which was quite active about social issues which broke the norm in Brussels, particularly around issues of racism and diversity, and how we deal with these questions in a European context, were not particularly. I was not particularly complimentary about the institutions. And I was that generated a lot of backlash, and to some degree you feel like you've got a target on your head. But I actually really enjoyed it, because I wasn't really there to toe the line and tell people that the way that they're approaching these things are correct. And the terrible fact about Brussels and the European Union institutions and the European Union journalism is that there is no diversity, and nobody ever raises these awkward questions about why there isn't. There is almost a consensus to not speak about these issues. And ultimately, when you're in Brussels, Europe is your beat. And Europe encompasses, at that point, 27 countries at minimum, millions and millions of people. And when only a small proportion of those people are constantly the ones that we write about, and their opinions form the opinions that we write about, there's a problem. So I think in some senses, like I'm really glad that I was thrown into such an alien environment where someone like me was considered to be an alien, because it was a brilliant way to get stories and to generate, some kind of conflict with the people that I was writing about, and feeling like an outsider in that sense was a brilliant way to like keep my journalistic juices sort of flowing all the time.
And that's absolutely fascinating. If we move on to your current position as the economics editor for the Times, what I was quite interested in is an early discussion. We discussed how the average age of the print reader for the Times is in they're in their 70s,
mid-70s, yeah.
Mid-70s, and what I was fascinated is I've always been very fascinated by diversity and the strengths that it brings, and one of the strengths is that those who are sort of creating the news, be it from a PR perspective or from a journalist perspective, should be representative of the publics who are consuming the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but if we go down that sort of thought, you really don't really reflect the audience of the Times reader, not only in terms of perhaps the gender, the age, sort of ethnicity, and so forth, and socio-economic. So how do you feel that what you bring to the table, when you're not particularly reflective of your target audience of the Times, how do you bridge that?
I think I've got a natural inbuilt advantage that I'm probably challenging a lot of my readers' conceptions or preconceptions about the economy or the orthodoxies that they sort of take for granted. And that, I would hope, enriches the way that people read the Times, because I write a column every week, but we have many other columnists. And if a reader has their favorite columnist who, so for example, the economics editor of the Sunday Times, he took that job before I was even born, David Smith. So he's been doing that job longer than I was born. David was there during Black Wednesday in the early 90s. He remembers, epochal economic events during Thatcherism, which I cannot draw upon, of course. And perhaps in some ways, as the two kind of economics reporters in the Times brand, we do represent two different sides of the coin. It's an interesting question. I think philosophical question about journalism is the chicken or an egg? Like, do we provide the opinions that satisfy the preconceptions of our readers, or is our job to put things out there that will then help inform agendas and do the opinion setting that our readers then take on? It's never entirely clear cut. I think the best thing for me is that I love the challenging part much more. Since I've been doing this job, which is just over a year and a couple of months, I've written about, I think, economic ideas around inflation and around interest rates, around global trade and policy, which I think go against the grain of what traditional Times readers would think. There are also readers that generationally, we are far apart. I am, middling type millennial. I understand the lived reality of people who find it difficult to get on the housing market, who are employed but don't necessarily have secure jobs, people who use the internet to make a lot of income, those who have come out of university with huge amounts of student debt. And the average skew of a Times reader is someone who's generally of a wealthier demographic. They live in the more, prosperous parts of the UK and Europe to some degree. They're asset rich, often own homes. They have pensions, which, most people right now would blush because it's so difficult. They have sort of this types of retirement arrangements that just don't really exist anymore in a modern economy. So that intergenerational tension is quite interesting. And I would hope that the fact that someone like me is doing this job, that's part of a way to maybe shift some of our, I think, received wisdom about what the Times represents, and broaden out the sort of hinterland and the entire expanse of what economics means. So I've written about progressive economic ideas, those that lean towards the left. My opinions about climate change probably don't win me too much support among some of my readers, but I'll be very honest, when I do engage with readers, they're very open. They tell me they disagree with me and why they disagree with me, but they're always willing to have the conversation about it. My age or experience is almost rarely ever brought up. And I think winning over the intellectual respect of people that disagree with you is quite an important part of this job, particularly if you're a new person in the newspaper. So I'm still getting to know the Times as a brand, and they're still getting to know me. And it's been actually been a really enriching experience so far. And if I do attract hate online, I kind of secretly enjoy it. It's just, I hate to say it, but I do. I really don't mind having annoyed someone so much that they're willing to write me a letter that day or send me an angry tweet.
I must say, I read the Times every day, and often I go straight to comments.
Yeah.
I love the comments. I think they're so funny. What I wanted to know is, obviously, a lot of journalists have transitioned into our industry, the PR industry, and I wanted to know, when you decided to go into journalism, did you ever consider PR?
Given the nature of the types of journalistic beats that I've done, I would say no, because it's never really been, so the different types of jobs that I've done, my interactions with PRs have been slightly more limited than some of my colleagues who do different types of beats. So when I started off in sports journalism, you'll have PRs for the clubs that you write about or some of the sporting institutions, but it's not necessarily a PR-driven environment. Sports is driven by live sport and the characters and the color around sport. That's almost it. Economics, again, is the sort of, it's a things-based journalism, not a human-centric journalism. I'm writing about numbers. I'm writing about different facets of the economy, often conceptual and theoretical, and trying to make them accessible. Again, so my interaction with PRs is a little bit limited. And then when I was in the European Union and writing about policy, it's a very political driven or diplomatic driven journalism. So it's some of my colleagues who have covered politics or have been in the lobby, my colleagues on the business desk at the time who cover companies and beats, they are have much more front-facing interaction with people in the PR industry, because it forms just a bigger part of what they do when they need to write about companies and institutions and brands. In politics, when you do the sort of, that political consultancy type interplay with PR is quite, it's become much more of a prominent area between the straddles journalism and PR right now. So I would say no. The people that I have known who've gone into PR have often done it from different types of beats than mine. And my interaction with PRs, I think it can be improved. And I'd like to tell PRs that when you're an economics editor or economics journalist, like, there's a relatively narrow stream of things that would catch my attention, and perhaps being very selective about what you send to people who cover economics, I think is a skill in and of itself.
And any advice that you would give to the PRs listening?
Yes, I think economics can seem big and broad, and at some point, you think, oh, economics means like Bitcoin, and it also means like mortgages and personal finance. And often, I'll be honest, it just doesn't. I think one of the interesting parts of PR that I think does have a lot of value is when I do markets-based journalism. So when I'm writing about developments in the financial markets, and some of the best PRs I've dealt with have clients whose job it is to analyze trends in financial data. And because they have the time and the tools to manipulate that financial data to understand that, this year was the worst year for X asset, UK assets, since XYZ, and that's a result of, Liz Truss, or the result of the UK's particular part of the UK. So joining up that data, numbers driven stuff with something that's real and political and about the economy is of huge value to me. I think only a couple of weeks ago we wrote about a story about the UK having one of the worst performing debt instruments compared to any other economy in the world, and somebody was able to do that number crunching. A client of the PR companies was able to do that number crunching because I just simply did not have the time. And as long as it's verified, that's a good story. So I think picking out financial market trends is quite fun. It's quite challenging, and it's new and it's refreshing because it's not necessarily something that other people would have spotted. So if anyone is listening to our conversation and thinks that they already got a client that does a lot of financial data collection, or whose job it is to understand trends in financial data, I think that's a lucrative way of engaging the interest of an economics journalist or a financial markets journalist. And I effectively do both of those jobs.
And what would be the best way for them to contact you? Do you like the phone calls? Do you like the emails? Do you read all the emails you get from PRs? Do you just put them straight in the spam folder? Do you sort of let's meet up for a coffee or a lunch? I mean, journalism's changed so much over the years, and obviously journalists have personal preferences.
Sure.
Some PRs, DM them on Twitter. What's your sort of preferences?
DMs, I don't mind at all. I think my DMs are open, but I'll double check that. I do spend a lot of time on Twitter. I think email is always best initially, and make sure that it seems simple to say this. A lot of people, will address an email to me and not have my name right. Or misgender me or something like that, and then I'm just not going to open it. And often, just to keep it pretty short and snappy, saying that you've got something that you think is of interesting to me, tell me what it is in as few words as possible. I am inundated with emails, so to some degree it has to be catchy and pretty brief. And often it's much better if you're telling me that you have something to offer me, rather than the prospect of something down the line where after a few months it could result in something. So if there is some sort of immediate sense in which this could fill a gap in your news hole for Monday or for the bank holiday, you're giving me a clear incentive to want to interact with you, because it will, it can be of use and service. And if you don't get a reply to the email and you think she probably just didn't see it, don't assume that. You should assume that the reason that you didn't hear back from me is because I'm not interested. If I have replied and said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and you don't hear back from me, then definitely give me a call. I think that's a very legitimate thing to do, because on my part it might just be a time management thing. But I would have to say at this point, 85% of my emails from from people offering me stories are just not of interest to me. They don't even get opened, let alone, read. We've been talking for about 20 minutes now. I dread to think what's happened to my inbox because it just, it does really, really, really pile up. And then once you have a relationship, so once we have worked together on a story, the likelihood that, we have further interactions, or then we meet in person and you tell me about what your client or what you think that you can offer, then the relationship can go from there. And I think it's that initial part of being very efficient, very concise, very sort of focused about what you think is important that I should know about, rather than a sort of a long kind of perspective. Maybe in the future this is coming down the track and we should stay in touch. It's much more. I work on very short deadlines, so I appreciate the fact that people can respect that as well.
And you don't find phone calls intrusive?
No. I'm always on my phone. Of course I am. I'm a millennial. So I like talking on the phone. It's often the fastest, most efficient way to do something. And as long as you're calling me because you want to follow up on something, rather than, you think that there might be something that's interesting of me, or maybe we can do something setting up later. That stuff's always better by email, calendar related stuff. So yeah, or other things are, if you have something under embargo and the embargo's like in a couple of hours and I haven't responded, but you think it's important that you want to just chase up, then that's always perfect. And often the last thing I would say is that often the PR is sending me something and there is a specialist that is worked on the issue or the matter at hand that they would like me to have a chat with. Copying that person in on the email or making that person available is always really, really helpful, because sometimes if I can't pick up a story, I have to give it to a colleague. Just making sure that the person who's, if we've got any questions, that they're on hand to deal with at relatively short notice over the phone, to meet a deadline. That's always great. If that person's already gone on their holidays, it becomes a bit more difficult to, do the follow-up chasing or the questioning. So, it sounds pretty basic, but you'd be surprised.
Okay, so basically immediacy. So really people approaching you with a timeline that is in the next week or two, relevance, and not the sort of like, we may have something in a few months that may or may not be of interest, and let's just meet for a vague coffee.
Exploratory, yeah, sure.
Okay, absolutely. So that's really clear. So thank you so much, Mehreen. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you, to understand your journey, and also your the way that you approach the sense of being an outsider and how that enriches your journalism is absolutely fascinating. So thank you again, Mehreen.
Thanks, Farzana.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Fuse. It's truly been fascinating for me to learn. If this is the first one that you've heard, search for PRCA Fuse on your favourite podcast app, where you'll find episodes on entrepreneurism, equity, diversity and inclusion, plus insights into purpose and so much more. Our home online is prca.org.uk.